Alright, so I've been doing this for a few years now, so and we've been kind of doing it the same way, and this is one of those cases where every now and then it should probably be mentioned that this is, when I do the videos like this, we're pretty much in a total, like, spoilery territory, and this is one of those cases where I think it's important to just kind of make sure that's out there before I go into it, because that's actually a very important aspect to more so one of these, but both of them to an extent. I suppose it depends on how you go into them and what you already know going into them, but so yes, now that's out of the way, I can tell you that it's pretty clear that the reason these two would be pitted together is they are the first two. There was also a Dangerous Method. The very great teaming of Viggo Mortensen and David Cronenberg, where Cronenberg is obviously no longer in that territory where he made like almost monster movies and like graphic bloody horror types like The Brood and Rabid and The Fly and all that stuff. So, and then here he kind of makes, they kind of have this same theme, we ultimately learn, where Viggo Mortensen plays a character that's kind of concealing another identity, whether consciously or unconsciously. So, yes, that's basically, they have more in common than you kind of realize unless you like really go into them. So, we're going to start actually with A History of Violence, which came out in 2005, and I believe holds the connotation that it is the last theatrically released movie to be released on VHS, which is interesting, of all movies. And we start here, actually, before we go into any of the major characters, we kind of start with characters that serve as, really, they're almost like MacGuffin characters. They seem like they're going to be really important because we start the movie off with them, and it turns out they're really only here just to be killed in the first half hour so that we can go in the direction we need to go. And this build-up is really damn creepy. It's Stephen McHattie, who's been in a number of things, and a guy that I can't remember his name now, but I used to mistake him for Jason Clarke. Their faces are very similar. I think Clark's a slightly bigger guy, though, but regardless, this opening scene, when they're at this motel, and we don't really know at first who they are or what they're doing, because almost this entire scene is on the outside of the motel, and when, you know, McHattie goes in and all that, we always stay on the outside. It's only when the other guy goes back in that we realize what's happened, but there are so many clues to kind of build us up, because as the scene progresses, they seem to be very shady. And then there's just that line. McHattie's really good in the really short amount of screen time he has in this because of how damn cold he has to be, and just the way he says the line, "I had a little trouble with the maid." And it kind of gives you that vibe of what happened before we actually see. And then the whole setup that even innocent little girls holding dolls will not be spared by these two guys, whatever it is they're doing. It seems like they're just going cross-country, wreaking havoc. It's really hard to say. But after that introduction, we're thrust into this world, and it's in these areas that I can kind of see this movie being quite off-putting, particularly if you don't know what you're in for. You should know what you're in for because of that opening scene. The opening scene is going to be the whole, no matter what you see from this point on, this shit is going to come back. Even if it's not necessarily these characters, the tone that these guys set is going to come back. And so we get this very perfect little small town place that is just absolutely disgusting in how perfect it is. It puts 50 sitcoms to shame with just how perfect everything is. Like, it gets so perfect to the point that when Tom first goes to the diner and the cook says "goddamn" a couple of times, your immediate thought is, "Oh my god, such language in this little place." Everybody knows everybody. It's always like, the departures always end in "see you in church," and it's just and then this opening scene after the motel scene has happened, when Tom's daughter has a nightmare, and this family is so perfect that this is a whole family ordeal, that this girl had one nightmare. So first Tom comes in, then the brother comes in, and then Maria Bello comes in. And it's like, who is this sickeningly perfect family? And of course, if you know, number one, if you know Cronenberg's style in general, and secondly, if you know what the story's building to, you know, all of this is basically just serving as a very, very stark contrast for where this is going to go. It's already a contrast to the opening scene, but we're going to get a lot more into it, and it's going to get a lot less perfect looking as it goes. And we get those moments when like Tom is so perfect, he just cleans up the trash that's laying out in front of the diner, and it's his diner, I suppose. And I do like that little tiny, I don't know if it's intentional foreshadowing or not, but that's how I'm gonna take it. When he's just, you know, it's everybody knows everybody, and he's greeting everybody as he gets to the diner. And the last dude that he greets before he goes into the diner is a guy named Joseph. And I always kind of hope that that was like intentional foreshadowing, because it's just such in passing, because he's just greeting everybody. And I like that that's kind of the last one before he goes inside. Obviously, foreshadowing his real name, his real identity. And then there's also kind of a bit of a foreshadow in there where it's when the cook is talking about how his girlfriend used to stab him in her sleep, and that he married her, and when everybody's kind of, you know, ribbing him for that, he looks right at him and says, well, nobody's perfect, Tom. And that's when you kind of, because obviously we've already established this is perfect little town, perfect little diner, perfect little family. And we kind of established in this one line, even you, Tom, likely aren't. And I don't think the cook even realized how much that was true. And then that even goes to when we get, obviously it's not a totally perfect life, but it's still kind of that, you know, what you imagined a normal life to be. When we see Jack go to school, and he has the best friend, and he's antagonized by this cardboard cutout of a bully. It's always wearing like his football jacket or whatever. And it's the most cliche bully character you've ever seen in your life. And their confrontations are just the most by-the-numbers shit you've ever seen. And obviously, this is the intention, because it sets up that this is one of those perfect... Like, they live in fucking Pleasantville. That's what they do. And obviously, this Pleasantville that they live in is going to get turned upside down. But we go one further in their normal everyday life, and it becomes less sitcom-y and more just real, like what a real life looks like when it's even we even get into their bedroom antics, and how even that is something that is it's a very, very interesting approach that they take, because obviously it's to show that their marriage is pretty much perfect, up to and including their sex life. Has to be incredibly healthy for them to be as perfect as they are. Which half kind of offsets the kind of perfect, you know, PG life we see them lead, but it also kind of leads perfectly into it, because it shows that everything about their relationship is going smoothly. But they still add those little realistic things in there, like when, it can seem a bit cheesy on the surface, because she's basically trying to play up that porn fantasy for him. Well, we were never teenagers, so let's do the teenager porn fantasy, where I'm in the cheerleader outfit and my parents are in the other room. But there's that moment when she pulls his belt off, and for a second she breaks character and is afraid that it broke something. And then they 69. Which, once again, shows that, it's a very conventional... I hope you can't hear. It's raining really heavily right now. I'm hoping that's not picking up on the sound too much. So yes, everything about them is perfect, even down to those behind the closed doors details. And then, of course, it's going to get into this turning point when Steve McHattie and the other guy come to the diner. And I kind of like the crossroads that happens when the bully's going to go kick Jack's ass and they run into Steve McHattie and his buddy, and it's like these two people who are both trying to antagonize, or are going to try and antagonize, Tom Stahl and his son, and both of them are going to pay the price for it, and they happen to cross paths here on the road. not really knowing who the other is. And I like the way McCaddy and the guy kind of jar the bully, where it's like we don't even see, like, he's supposedly going to go over and kick Jack's ass, but then we never go into that because we follow them when they leave. And it's like, I get the feeling that the bully was so kind of, you know, jarred by seeing them, he just went home and, like, hid under his bed. Because they're just so threatening, just the way they look. And then we go in, and there's obviously this turning point where this perfect little world is turned upside down when Joey comes out of Tom and he just murders the fuck out of these people. When we see the specific detail of half of McCaddy's face being blown off, that is when we kind of reach the point of, okay, now we're thrust in, this world is colliding with this one, and that's the starting point. But still, there's kind of that constant mystery. It's a very interesting mystery the first time around, the first time you see it, because you really kind of wonder if that is the case. And it's like, once you realize that he really is who Fogarty says he is, and then after a while you kind of think, well, yeah, I guess so. I mean, what other outcome could there have been? It just kind of seems obvious once you know, but there's always that really interesting mystery the first time you watch it, because it's like probably an hour in before the true reveal. So I thought that was handled in a very interesting way, and I love how they kind of do the crossover point when it really, really comes to be. And it's when, obviously, Fogarty has been terrorizing them, and now he's waiting outside the house again, and he has Jack hostage, basically. I can't remember exactly how that could have happened, but he has Jack in his custody now. And Tom comes out, and it's at some point in here, in this little sidewalk from the house to where Fogarty's standing, somewhere walking that distance, is when Joey comes out of Tom and fully takes over. And I like that Jack can see it. Like, I'm not a huge fan of Ashton Holmes, who plays Jack. Not a big fan of his performance in this, but I mean, he does have to do that cliche teenager, you know, kind of standoffish thing. But still, in this one moment when we kind of see him see that who he's looking at isn't his dad now, isn't Tom Stahl now. And that's kind of the turning point. And then obviously the full-on reveal, if you don't consider that when he smashes the guy's nose in and kills the other dude, it's when he finally just flat out tells Fogarty that he should have killed him in Philadelphia. And so that's where Mortensen's performance really comes into play, because the thing here is you can kind of see it in his face. Like, it's kind of like there seems to slightly be something different about him, but it's when Jack looks like he's looking at somebody else. When we cut back to Mortensen, it is like we're looking at somebody else's face than we were in the last cut. And that's the brilliance of what he's able to bring to this. And how he's kind of able to do, because even later in the movie, it's like, it just seems to go back and forth. There's never like one scene where he's Joey and one scene where he's Tom. It seems like it kind of goes back and forth in the middle of scenes. And the way he's able to pull that off is insane. Like, I would think that's unthinkable. But if there is an actor that could pull something like that off, I would fully believe that Viggo Mortensen is that person, even if we didn't have the proof right in front of us. And I do like talking about Fogarty's death in that scene. I do also kind of like the, it's handled in just a good enough way. Like, an example of where it's poorly handled would be another William Hurt movie. The scenes with Daniel Panabaker and Mr. Brooks kind of tried to do this a couple years later, and it really didn't work. And that's the whole, if the father is a killer, is it in the kid's blood? And there's the whole kind of foreshadowing throughout the movie where Jack has this shotgun put in front of him at least a couple of times. And at one point he picks it up and is told to put it back down, and then eventually, whether it be what he's witnessed or whether it be just the Joey Cusack blood in him, this random teenager who gets bullied in school and just sits around and gets high is able to bring himself to shoot Carl Fogarty in the back, even if it's to save his dad or Joey's life. He doesn't even know if that's his dad. Well, the person he knows to be his dad that he's saving. but he can bring himself to shoot Carl Fardy in the back and kill him instantly. And it's something that's not really explored too much after that. It's more about how it kind of affects the family trying to realize that they're not, mainly from Maria Bello's perspective, that the family isn't really what they think it is. Like, the daughter, maybe the daughter is young enough to where this won't affect her enormously, but Maria Bello and Jack, Edie is her, I kept forgetting her name. Edie and Jack are the ones that are really affected and basically feel like they have to take on new lives now because their life is not what they thought it was. And so we kind of get past the whole how far Joey Cusack's blood is going to take with his offspring, but still, though it does make the movie a pretty swift 90 minutes, which is a pretty good runtime for a story like this, and it moves very quickly. And I do like some of the stuff they're able to fit in, like the digs they take at the media, too, after Tom becomes a hero. And there's that moment when the reporter's waiting outside his house, and the way she words it, like it's supposed to be this small town, she wants to know, you know, if they're alright and what the scoop is, but her wording is the, like, how did you feel when those ruthless killers had their guns pointed right at you? And it's this kind of nice little, and how she's kind of, like, disappointed when she doesn't really get much out of him, and just shrugs and walks away, pissed off. So I like that little dig they kind of threw in there, because that's pretty much how it would play out. How they take this more or less hard-to-believe idea and kind of put it in this relatively real world, even if this real world is, you know, half Sexy Beast, half Pleasantville. And, and how they've actually managed to collide and make kind of a more or less realistic world, realistic enough world. Because obviously it is based on a graphic novel, which I have laying around here somewhere, and I don't know if you've taken a look, but they pretty much... This is a full-on script adaptation. That novel is almost nowhere to be found in this script, if my memory serves correctly. Which is nice, because I actually think I like the story for the movie better than I did in the book. I don't know if that's because I had kind of already latched on to the movie before I read the book, but I actually like what the movie does a lot more. It definitely stuck with me a lot more, so... And yeah, the plot does ask you to take this big leap of faith in regards to... We're supposed to believe it's not necessarily that Joey was hiding as Tom the whole time, but that Joey actually went out and basically taught his mind to be Tom, to where he literally forgets his other life. That's a lot to ask of an audience, but I think the movie pulls it off well enough, especially with the way Mortensen's able to kind of show us that that's not necessarily just Joey bullshitting. Like, it's actually, he really was somehow able to pull that off. And how it kind of affects the family. I've talked about this before. I'm really not quite sure how I feel about Maria Bello as an actress, because she's very much... She has moments of brilliance in many of her performances, like this and The Cooler and Downloading Nancy and stuff like that. But you'll notice in those same performances, there are also moments where she can tend to really maybe take a step too far. Like, she has some really good subtle moments here. She has a very... Like, when she's confronting Fogarty at the mall, you can sense, like, a real protectiveness that her family must feel behind her. And there's more tender moments and stuff like that. But then there's stuff like the dry heaving at the hospital when he's trying to explain to her the difference between Joey and Tom, and that's kind of an embarrassing moment for her in her career, but it's just a little moment, but still, it's one of those cases where all of Maria Bello's performances pretty much seem to have that bit of kind of unevenness in them, but when she's great, she's really great, so that's the thing to take away from this. Obviously, I love how sinister Ed Harris is in this. I think I read somewhere that to kind of toy with Viggo Mortensen a little bit, he did the scenes at the diner. Since he was obscured from here down, he would do those scenes without pants, just to throw Viggo Mortensen off. I hope that's true. I honestly do. Because you always kind of picture this Ed Harris as this really serious actor and stuff. And speaking of serious actors, this whole movie seems to be building up to one thing, and that is the Oscar-nominated performance of William Hurt that shows up in the last 10 minutes of the movie. He's probably in the movie for a total of like 7 minutes, and it's very, very brief. The more you watch the movie, the shorter that scene seems. But it is... there's a reason for that. I have heard some back and forth thoughts on this performance itself and the fact that it's an Oscar-nominated one. I think it's one of the more insanely wonderful choices that the Academy has made in the last 20 years or so. Because it's just a small performance, but it's from obviously a very well-respected actor who's been... Obviously, he won his Oscar in '85 because of the Spider one, where he was this very flamboyant gay man, but then he also did comedies like kind of in that Lawrence Kasdan vein, like I Love You to Death and The Accidental Tourist and stuff like that. Then he did these really heavy dramas and stuff like Children of a Lesser God and all that, and roles in like Michael, the John Travolta Angel movie. And then here, it kind of felt like we were seeing a side of him we hadn't really before. But he was able to kind of combine a lot of different things here, because obviously there's the whole brotherly relationship between Richie and Joey. And the first time we see him descend the steps, and he's been built up through the whole movie as the head, like the main dude we're looking for. And when he first comes down and he greets Joey, and they do like the head thing and me and my brother still like quote the broheme thing when we talk to each other, and a lot of his dialogue in it, like the little dialogue he has, we're always like quoting the dialogue back and forth because this scene just stuck with us so much. And how, even though he's like the big head of the organization, and there's obviously a rivalry here, I love how it immediately starts off with they're talking about the track and turf, and he says, "Didn't you bang Jill Levy there?" And he's like, "Well, I never banged her." And he's like, "Well, you should have." And it's this very brotherly dialogue between the two of them. And the scene slowly descends. That's what makes Hurt's performance so good here, is this whole scene goes on how he is taking what's in front of him, because we know eventually where he stands. We know he needs this scene to end with Joey being killed, but we start off with the brotherly introduction and all that, and we have to slowly get to realizing what Richie wants out of this. I love the moment when Joey first gets there and he says, when Richie says, "Why didn't you send a postcard?" And Joey says, basically, "If I contacted you, I didn't know what would happen to me." And I love how we kind of have that. We're kind of unsure because one minute it's like Richie's ready to embrace him, and then the next minute Richie could just kill him. Just like that, emotionless. It could be whatever the next move he makes towards Joey is, could be one or the other. And that's the sense we get through this whole kind of 5 to 7 minute scene. And he kind of, eventually he gets to blow up, he gets to do the Ben Kingsley and Sexy Beast stuff. And it's all great. And he kind of, the way we so casually get into his darkness. The way he's just talking to Joey like normal, and just right in mid-conversation is like, "You know, when you were a baby, I tried to strangle you in your crib. But I guess everybody tries that." And he's just so casual about what he wants to do to him, and that delivery of "better late than never" is it's so dark and twisted. I love this performance so much, and that he was able to make basically a whole scene surrounding his character, and the big question is what his character's gonna do, and the scene's only like 5 minutes long. It's great. It's really masterful stuff. And like I said, the scene feels like when you've seen the movie as many times as I have, and you love the scene as much as I do, the whole thing feels like 30 seconds. This whole final confrontation. And I just absolutely love it. So, yes, so the thing here is, and of course the last scene, before I forget, what the last scene implies, where it's like, are they going to accept him? Like, is Joey Cusack going to be the father now? Is he going to try to revert back to Tom Stahl even though Joey's been resurrected? Are they going to hide everything? Is the family going to stay intact? What's going to happen? There is a push in one direction when, obviously, the daughter, who once again probably has no idea what's going on, brings him the plate and all that. And you're like, well, it's the daughter, so they're probably... It's hard to tell what they think. And then Jack offers him the meatloaf, and then we get this ambiguous back and forth look between Edie and Joey, and it kind of leaves you wondering where it's going to go from there. I don't think it's positive. I think we've kind of reached a point here to where you can't really come back. You can't really come back from something like this. They could try. Like, that's kind of what I foresee, is they'll try to stay a family, but Edie trying to get used to seeing Joey and not Tom, and realizing, trying to rebuild the lie that was her life, it's very, it's not very, I don't think it's very optimistic. In this whole thing, like, obviously he does sever ties. Like, the highest of the high was Richie. Richie's dead, Fogarty's dead, their guys are dead, everything, but once again, you know, that is kind of a Hyder situation. There's always something else. But in this particular case, I don't even think it's just that. Like, he's long on. He's like 16 hours away, and everything should be fine. Everybody's under the impression he's another identity, but I think the family's gonna come apart. I'm not sure exactly what the consensus is on that ending, but that's how I've always taken it. So yes, so when you look at these two things colliding, you realize that this movie could have been a tonal nightmare. Like, this movie could be all over the place as far as the feel of it and what it's trying to say and show us, and how weirdly contrasted they are. But Cronenberg really brought out his masterful side and really was able to put them together into this one very cohesive thing and make a very, very effective story on, you know, a whole bunch of things. It's like, it's half, you know, family drama, it's half gangster movie. It's this kind of take on identity, it's a take on, once again, just family in general, family values and all that. And just being a good person, and having kind of skeletons in your closet, and just how extreme maybe those can go, and exactly this whole behind closed doors thing. There's a whole lot this movie say, and I think it says it all pretty much perfectly. Like I said, there are a couple of things here and there, like when did Fogarty get Jack and stuff like that, and a couple of the performances. But apart from that, I think it's very difficult to find a flaw. So, not to mention, I just really love this disc, too. I know that's a strange compliment, but usually, like with Eastern Promises, you have just like the normal, you know, reflective discs or whatever. But I think whoever did this design should get a raise, because that is amazing. So, I really hope that person is well off. So, so having said all that, let's go over a couple years later to Eastern Promises. And the thing about Eastern Promises here that's really perfect is we start off in what seems to be two totally different directions, where we have this, you know, 14-year-old girl that could be a druggie, could be a prostitute. At the time, we're not really sure, and she's pregnant, and she's looking for help. And she hemorrhages and dies in childbirth. And then over here, we have one of the most vicious throat slicings in movie history. Like, 2007 brought us two of the most vicious throat slicings you'll ever see. It's the opening scene in Eastern Promises, and Sacha Baron Cohen and Sweeney Todd. And both movies that also happened to score Best Actor nominations, go figure. And so we have these two moments that are so different. They're blood-drenched moments, but they're also somehow going to collide. And we have the kind of starting points for each thing here, and they so kind of slowly... Stephen Knight is our screenwriter here, who recently got a lot of acclaim for writing and directing Locke, and writing a lot of other great stuff. And he's kind of able to make these kind of story threads kind of fall weightlessly until they just kind of come into place. And it almost just kind of like, before you even realize it, like you're just watching the movie and then it kind of occurs to you, oh, we've already kind of flowed nicely and locked into place here, when it seemed like we were starting from two totally different directions. Another movie with a very kind of swift runtime for the kind of movie it is. I think it's about 1:40. And everything ties up so nicely, and very, very swiftly, yet it doesn't feel rushed either. So And the thing here also is that we kind of feel like we're thrust into it already, because you'll notice that there are a few major characters in this movie with Viggo Mortensen's Nikolai and Naomi Watts, I think her name is Anna, and Kirill, who is Vincent Cassel, as well as our big boss, Armin Mueller-Stahl. And the thing is that these are our major characters, and like none of them, like all of their intros into the story are very unceremonious. Like they just, so like it feels like we were just kind of, there's no start of the movie and end of the movie. It's basically this world already existed. Everything in this story was already moving and working its magic. And this just happened to be when we were allowed to get a glimpse of it. And so they're just, like, when we're introduced to Viggo Mortensen and Vincent Cassel, they just walk into the story and they're already in the middle of something. And it's like there's no big intro, there's no pointing at who's going to be the major characters and who's going to be just off to the side. It's just like this is a world that exists, and this is when the window opened and let us take a look at it. So I really liked that approach, and obviously the storytelling is so good that it occurs to us very quickly who's important and how important they are, and what part they play. And there's also, and another person real quick to introduce into the story is, I guess they wanted to keep up the name Tatiana, because Tatiana obviously is the name of the pregnant girl, but when her diary is being translated, if that voice sounds familiar, it's Tatiana Maslany, who I don't believe was much of anything at the time here, but since she's now known for being the lead in Orphan Black, it's her voice that we're hearing when we're hearing the translation of the diary. So it's like they needed somebody to embody the voice of a woman named Tatiana. Why not cast a Tatiana? So I'd like to think that's how Cronenberg looked at it. And one of the things to talk about here is the movie's major Oscar nomination, Viggo Mortensen's Best Actor nomination, which, much like William Hurt, is such a weird and wonderful thing for the Academy to gravitate towards. Because this was 2007. Remember, this was a really big year of that decade in movies. And that his performance got singled out really says something, because it's really not big at all. And it's very much, he's so effortless about this performance. Like, you think he's playing, a Russian or whatever, so the question is, like, what's his accent gonna be like, or is he gonna be able to do the accent while also, getting into the depth of his character? It really doesn't matter. Because it seems, like I said, it feels like this character is so lived in by the first time we see him. And he's just got this such effortless way about him. Just like that shot where he's got the hairdryer and he's trying to unfreeze the dead body, and he's just got the cigarette hanging from his mouth. And it's like, this guy is so... I'm not even sure if I'm talking about Nikolai or Mortensen at this point, but it's like, this guy is so effortless in everything he does. And it's like, but there's also, whether you're trying to separate Nikolai from Mortensen, it's like, well, they're both playing a part, so really you can look at it either way. It's like, you could say Mortensen so effortlessly is acting through this scene, or you could say Nikolai is so effortlessly acting like one of these guys when he's, I can't necessarily say anything, but he's a really violent, brutal dude. He just also happens to be a cop as well. So the thing here is, and the follow-up when he puts the cigarette out on his tongue is just, and the way he's able to kind of just, like I said, that's really the best way I can put it, because it's really just a performance you have to see to understand where such an acclaim would come from, because it seems like there's hardly any acting in there. But we know this is not the type of guy Viggo Mortensen really is, at least from what we know from seeing around. He seems like a stable person. He seems like a non-violent person. But he just seems this character feels like such a real person and such an intimidating presence. And also, I always thought it was kind of interesting, too, that I feel like when we see Nikolai in suits and he's wearing the sunglasses, that he has this odd resemblance to Carl Fogarty from History of Violence. I'm assuming that's not intentional, but it always kind of gets me when I see it. And then we add on to Watts' character, who, despite the fact that she just had a boyfriend that left her and she lives with her parents, pretty much as soon as we see her with this baby, and it's a very important thing throughout the movie, is there's such a maternal thing about her, and that's a real driving point as she kind of inserts herself into this violent underworld. This very maternal figure who really wants nothing more than for this baby to be okay. And the thing about it is just kind of the irony in general of, by trying to preserve this life, she's this newborn life, she has to end up in this world that's all about, violence, brutality, and ultimately bloody and violent death. And how those kind of contrasts come together when she is forced into this story, or forces herself into this story. And I think she handles that, once again, quite effortlessly. She's always really great with those parts. Her best performance, I think, ever was probably Mother and Child, which if you didn't see, you absolutely must. Even if just for her... It's a really good movie, but her performance takes it to a whole new level. And I really always loved the casting of Arn Mueller-Stahl as the head of the family. It's like, it just seemed like one of those cases where he was one of those actors where 11 years prior he had an Oscar nomination for Shine, but he was one of those actors that was just kind of there. He was a veteran actor. Like, everybody, they may not know his name, but they certainly know his face, and he just pops up from movie to movie every now and then. And it's like, when you see him in this part, you're like, that is absolute perfection as far as casting. Like, there is no... Like, I would have never thought of that, but now it seemed like the only choice. It's just that great. And that's absolutely perfect. The way he's able to play off the whole... He's so intimidating. Like, everybody in the movie fears nobody more than they fear him. And he really gets off that whole... Like, when he's with Watts in the room with the babies, there's something about him that we know he's a threat, but there's also kind of that kind of paternal thing about him. But then there's also moments when he's the raging homophobe and the very violent person and ultimately the rapist. And he really just plays to perfection. Like I said, it's one of those parts where you're just like, I don't know who thought of that, but it's definitely the best choice. And I do like that it also kind of feels kind of old-fashioned as far as, like, mobster movies go, where it's just kind of it kind of has that old-fashioned feel, and then there's, like, how their cover is a restaurant, and how, like, we have the wars going on, and it all feels very old-fashioned mobster movie. But it also has it certainly has its own thing. Like, it goes kind of beyond the mobster movie and really becomes about kind of these characters and how they their realism is what makes them so strong, and how the eventual turning point that we get to, where despite all the blood and the carnage and the death, this movie's climax is whether or not a guy drowns a baby, and that he's just kind of talked out of it. And this is a guy that's like, this is Vincent Cassel playing a mobster. This is, this guy's going to be off his rocker just by the casting of Vincent Cassel alone. And that's the climax of this movie. It's just, he wants to drown this baby, and then he's like, okay, I'll give it to you. I love life. And that's it. That's our ending. And it's all about that human element much more than how much bloodshed can we have, and the whole... It doesn't have that mobster movie ending where everybody fucking dies and it's a bloodbath. It's just one human choice a character has to make, and two other characters have to bring out of him. And it's such an unconventional turn in a story like this. And it's really fascinating. But apart from those really violent aspects too, it's not without, a bit of a sense of humor, if sometimes a dark one. I particularly like the moment when Cassell's on the phone with the guy and he has to explain that the coast is clear as an expression and not, in fact, to be taken literally. And stuff like that. And then there is the whole thing about how the tattoos you get in Russian prisons basically tell your story, how if you don't have tattoos, then you don't exist. And I like how Cronenberg actually kind of uses it, and Steve and I actually use that throughout the story, how it's actually a point, or it's not just kind of something that's just thrown in there, like it eventually becomes part of the story, how important that is. So I really like the way that they use that to kind of tell their own story, in the same way that the tattoos themselves tell the story of the person that they're on. And of course, we wouldn't be discussing Eastern Promises if we didn't bring up its most famous scene. where we mention, you talk about fight scene, like we talked about The Raid recently, and how fight scenes kind of tend to be one thing anymore, a very conventional thing, but then The Raid kind of, started a new starting point. But there is also the fight scene in Eastern Promises, which is pretty much unlike most we've probably seen. And it's not just the nudity aspect of it, but the absolute total brutality of it, and how watching the guy whose side we're kind of on in this, where it's usually the hero, takes a hit or two, but ultimately beats everybody's asses. This is a brutal, grueling fight, and the protagonist, I guess, in this fight, well, sure, takes just as many hits and sheds just as much blood as the guys that he's fighting. And the way that they just beat and crack themselves down to the point that the finale of this fight, the two guys can't even stand. They're just laying on the ground, beating each other until he finally gets that stab in the eye, and everything is just so brutal and graphic and in your face, but not in a way that feels like in an exploitive kind of way, or in a way that like just sets out to be shocking and brutal, but it really feels, it just brings something to the scene you don't typically see in fight scenes like this. And the whole thing just kind of sets this set this new standard. Like, it's even hard to bring The Raid into this because it's such a different kind of thing. Whereas where movies like The Raid, the fight scenes are more about kind of the art of it and the choreography and all that. This is just throw down, just no matter how beaten and down you are, just kill the other guy. Just do whatever you can to kill the other guy. And I really loved that approach. So, yes, and I like the way they handle, obviously, it's one of those movies that has, it's not built necessarily on its twist, but even so, it's one of those movies where there is a turning point in this story towards the end where it makes it into one of those movies where your first viewing of the movie and your second viewing of the movie are basically two different movies because of one plot point that's pretty much only discussed in one scene. Like, just one scene makes this movie a totally different movie from your first viewing to your second viewing. And it really makes you go into Mortensen's performance and the character of Nikolai himself in general. And really changes the way you see the movie. And that's not necessarily to say, I could see the argument where it's such a big difference that it's one of those movies where there's nothing like the first viewing. And the second viewing won't give you near as much as the first did because you know too much. But I don't know, I do feel like it gives you a lot more to look at from the technical aspect, at least from how Nikolai's character was created and what exactly goes on here. How, they talk about how well-informed his character is, and just right off, Nikolai has an answer for that, to why that is. And just all that stuff, and how there's tiny, itty-bitty clues. Like, there's never one big clue that's going to give it away to somebody on their first viewing. It's going to be something that there are just tiny little things you want to look for the next time you see it, or frequent times you see it. And that's a really brilliant way to do it, to where it's almost like you make a second movie because of one plot point, but then again, you can still appreciate everything about it that you did before. There's just one extra layer to it. So that's really brilliantly done. So, yeah, so that's what Eastern Promises is. I believe Eastern Promises is technically the much more acclaimed one of the, not much more, but it's the more acclaimed one of these two. And while I do absolutely respect the hell out of Eastern Promises and everything it accomplishes, I must say, A History of Violence is probably one of my favorite movies. So, it's kind of always been that one, and it's definitely one I gravitate more towards, but still, the way they are able to take their stories they already have and put those human elements in them, makes them something really special, so that's the case. So, I prefer History of Violence, but, once again, takes nothing away from either one, so that's what we have here. So, I'm not sure what's going on lately. There's well, Baby Driver is going to be next week, which I am crazy fucking excited for, as you can probably guess. Versus, we're going to do the big thing where I put one franchise against another. I'm not sure. I was going to do that the following week, but it might be the week after that, so we'll figure out what we're doing in between there. And we've got Spider-Man coming up, so we're going to look forward to that. So, with all that being said, hopefully you had already seen these before I went through this, so a lot of this was probably obvious to you. Otherwise, you know all of its twists and turns, which sucks, because these movies deserve to be seen and to be able to watch how those things unravel. But, so yeah, hopefully I said something that isn't, totally obvious or whatever. So, I think that's going to do it for this. So, that's it.